Where do we get off calling some people more ancient than others? One group that's been fetishized like this over and over are the Southern African hunter gatherers. You've probably heard them called the San, maybe even Bushmen. Let's talk about that. The Kalahari Basin, this massive, semi arid region stretching from Namibia and Botswana in the north to South Africa in the south, has been home to some of the oldest, most continuous human cultures on Earth. It's not just a desert, it's a memory field. And the people who've lived there, they've changed, they've adapted, and they've become part of the land and left their mark on it at every step. Now, about those names. Bushman comes from the Dutch settlers. It basically meant bandit, a slur for people who wouldn't fit inside colonial order. San itself came from the Khoisan herders, mocking foragers for not raising cattle. Neither were compliments, and even though you'll still see San used on websites today, even by advocates, it's almost always paired with a proper group name, like the Johansi. So in this video, I'll use Southern African hunter-gatherers. Not because it's perfect, but because it avoids the slurs and acknowledges that we're talking about many peoples, not one flattened label, despite the similarities. And there are dozens of these groups, each with their own name, their own way of life, their own rhythm. You probably heard the click sounds in their languages, so distinct that I put them on screen instead of trying to pronounce them. And those click sounds, those are unique to Southern Africa. They're spoken by the Southern African hunter-gatherer groups, as well as neighboring groups like the Khoisan, those pastoralists, and Nama, also pastoralists. These clicks have roots stretching back tens of thousands of years in the region, and getting into the nuance of the language families is complicated, especially given how old and how isolated some of these groups and languages themselves, and some that are extinct, so we don't necessarily have a whole picture, make it a bit harder to necessarily pin down everything specific about these languages so far. Over time, those languages, though, split into distinct branches, and they were tied to regions, kinship, story, and memories to the land. Today, Southern African hunter-gatherer communities live across a wide stretch of countries: Namibia, Botswana, Angola, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. Most, however, are concentrated in Namibia and Botswana, though, and not necessarily by choice, mostly politically. For generations, these groups migrated seasonally, moved with the land, and returned to familiar places. But colonialism locked that down. Borders were drawn up, land was seized, entire tribes and people were erased. And the ones who survived had to flee, and they had to adapt. And today, many are left in the ecological and political margins, the places no one else wanted. Places where you couldn't really grow food like the farmers needed, or raise cattle like the pastoralists. And it's this unique way of life that intrigued scientists to want to know more about these groups and learn more about the genetic story that they carry. And when researchers look at their DNA, they find that these communities diverged, split off from, quote unquote, the main human population over 100,000 years ago, meaning they're separated from that bottleneck event around like 60,000 years ago, 40 to 60,000 years ago. And so they're just not a part of that. And so it doesn't mean that they're less evolved by any means. It just means their ancestors took a different path that didn't mix with many of our ancestors today. And so they became isolated and unique, but still human, still us, still part of the same story. And so why do we talk about them like they're stuck in the Stone Age? Why do governments fund research into their ancient bloodlines, but still treat them like outcasts? Why do we label them as primitive when their cultures are adapted, enduring, and emotionally complex, just like yours and just like mine? There's no going back to a pure hunter-gatherer lifestyle, not in a world carved up by fences and economies and political violence. So what does honoring their traditions look like now? That's the question. And while we sit with it, I want to show you where their stories live. Not just in bones or bloodlines, but in stone, in paintings, in rituals still practiced today, in the places where people danced and sang and healed one another for tens of thousands of years. Now remember, even calling these groups a they, as if they were all one group, is already off. They're not. There are at least 7 distinct communities across the main region, with smaller bands in more remote areas, each with their own language, identity, and customs. But one thing many of these groups share is the way they recorded their stories onto the land. Across cliffs and caves, they left images, engravings, paintings, symbols, layered, lived in, sacred. And when we look at this rock art, we notice something fascinating. There are patterns found across Africa, but some things are distinct, recognizably Southern African hunter-gatherer. Trance dances, communal hunts, figures stretching or shifting shape. This wasn't just documentation, it was worldview. And their art evolved over time, just like any culture. But they kept recording, and they kept painting their experience of the country, of community, of continuity. Still, let's not oversimplify. Saying this is San rock art is like saying this is European music. You get themes, sure, but not the nuance. So do today's Southern African hunter-gatherer groups claim these paintings as their own? It's complicated. Some groups, like the Johansi, recognize certain sites as sacred, but they don't always say, "We made this." Others, like the Jam, a race now only preserved by Bleak and Lucy, who spoke at length to colonial scholars in the 1800s, gave rich, poetic accounts of the meanings behind the art. But even they spoke about the ancestors doing the painting, not necessarily groups that they would consider themselves. There's no single pan hunter-gatherer claim that says this is all ours, but instead it's more of a claim that they're all part of the continued spirit. And what exists instead is a deep respect, a sense of continuity, a stewardship of meaning that passes through generations. And that's where we're headed next. Let's visit some of the most awe-inspiring rock art sites in the world, still honored, still interpreted, and still alive in the spirit of the people who descend from these lands. Starting at Sodio Hills in Botswana, this place has over 4,500 rock paintings. That's just what's been documented. It's a site of memory layered over 20,000 years. And you'll see giraffes, rhinos, cattle, people, and the ancestors. It's not just a tourist stop, it's sacred, even today. Local guides, many of them not just hunter-gatherer descendants, but urban citizens too, lead visitors through the hills with reverence. The red paintings seen here are older, usually tied to the forager groups, while the white ones, often attributed to Bantu speakers, later arrivals. And you can literally see this moment of cultural turnover on the stone itself. Two styles, one fading into the next. It's not hostile, it's human. One story written over another, but still there. Next, the Dwarab Mountains, also called Brandberg, in Namibia. This site has more than 1,000 different locations with over 50,000 images. Most painted more than 2,000 years ago. There's scenes of life and of dance, of healing, and of hunting. And not a lot of hierarchy. No pharaohs, no kings, just people, just a community. Then there's the White Lady, a mysterious figure that's drawn a lot of attention. Some say she's a shaman. Some say a spiritual being mid-transformation. We'll never know for sure. And perhaps that's what adds to her allure. Of course, though, it wouldn't be a site in Africa without someone trying to take the credit away. Monsieur Bruhl, you might remember him from our Tassili video, once suggested Mediterranean influence, as if Southern Africans couldn't create something this powerful on their own. That kind of erasure used to be standard, but we know better now, or we're trying to. And finally, we reach the Drakensberg, called Ukalamba or Maloti, the Dragon's Rest, the Ridge of Spears, depending on your language. The mountains themselves are breathtaking, but the art is something else. Here you'll find not just animals or people, but therianthropes, half human, half animal figures. This is where the trance dances come alive on the rock. People floating, bleeding from the nose, becoming rainmakers, becoming healing conduits, becoming more than themselves. And they didn't do it with drugs. They did it through heat. They did it through rhythm, and through community, through generations of practiced, sacred connection. And here's the hard part. These places, Sadio, Tuareg, Drakensberg, they're still here. The art is still here. But the people? Mostly they're gone. Maybe not in Botswana, but in Drakensberg, in Tuareg, in the Saderberg region. And it's not because they left. It's because they were pushed out through murder, through forced assimilation, through cultural erasure. Some groups still live nearby. Some even help steward these sites. But most, they've been sidelined, politically, economically, and spiritually. You don't feel their presence in the same way anymore. And it's not because they didn't return. It's because they weren't allowed to. In Botswana, some groups have found ways to participate in site management and tourism. But in other places, they're treated as relics, like the art, like the land. And that's what hurts. Because these aren't just interesting people from a different past. They're a window into a way of life that's almost been forgotten by all of us, but that's just as valid, just as beautiful, and just as complex as any other. They're not frozen in time. They've always been adapting and changing, but we still treat them like a failed prototype, or worse, a curiosity. I hope this story and the artwork you've seen help shift that just a little. These people are still here, and the art is still here. The connection is still possible. I can't leave it there because it's not the full story. Yes, we've seen example after example of people being pushed off their land. But some southern African hunter-gatherer communities are still here, and still adapting and changing to the world. Take the Nyanya Conservancy in Namibia. Here you'll find a strong Tohansi community, craftspeople, hunters, farmers, and they've held on, not just to some untouched version of the past, but to the spirit of it. They still dance. They still pass down stories. They still turn into animals during the healing trance. But even this, what looks like survival, is shaped by compromise. Many are integrated into a small economy. They sell crafts, they harvest and export devil's claw, a root used to treat arthritis in Europe. Their traditions survive, yes, but they survive within a system shaped by outsiders, and it's not easy. In 2025, a report in the Windhoek Observer included an interview with David Musamba, a San activist. In 2024, a report in the Windhoek Observer included an interview with David Musamba, a San activist. He spoke around the difficulty of even burying their dead under Namibia's modern regulations. Imagine having to carry a dead body to the road and ask a driver to help you transport it to Indira. Sometimes we get help from the game rangers. If you go through the process to obtain documentation and eventually the coffin, it takes a long time. Sometimes up to 2 months. What must we do in the meantime? Let that sink in. A people whose ancestors buried their dead with song and ceremony, now waiting weeks just to get a coffin approved. They're not asking for pity, they're asking for space, for dignity. And yet they're still dancing, still healing, still tracing the steps of those who painted their spirits into the stone. Now there's this wider debate happening. Some people call it the Kalahari Society question. Basically, were these southern African hunter-gatherers part of a larger, more complex society, or were they completely isolated? Some researchers point to tool exchange, shared motifs in the art, and even rock paintings showing foragers watching over Bantu cattle. They suggest a kind of class system where the foragers weren't separate, but subordinate. Others push back. They say the groups were distinct, autonomous, and not integrated like that. So what's the truth? Honestly, I think it's this. These aren't one people. Some groups clearly did interact with outsiders before, during, and after colonial arrival, and for generations, they've been treated worse than their neighbors. That's not just a theory, that's in the land access, burial rights, language preservation, and living conditions. Even in the pre-colonial past, there's reason to believe these groups were often positioned at the bottom of the social order without needing any official empire to make it so. In fact, up until the 1930s, some regions literally issued hunting permits to kill San people. So where does that leave us? People are dynamic, and cultures change, lines blur, but what hasn't changed is this. These communities have been speaking, surviving, and remembering through stories, song, and ceremony, and silence. And if we want to understand their history, we have to listen to them. Not just the archaeologists, not just the outsiders, but the people who still live in these landscapes, who still dream beside the painted stones, who still hunt in the ways of their forefathers, and who still remember what it means to become something else. So what does all this mean? It means we don't need to preserve people in a jar to respect their past. We don't need to force them back into a romanticized lifestyle. But we also shouldn't treat them like they've expired, like the land moved on and they didn't. Southern African hunter-gatherer communities aren't lost. They're still living out in the bush. They're not fossils, they're people. And like all people, they've changed, sometimes by choice, often by force. And still they remember. They remember how to dance. They remember how to heal. And they remember the lines between body and spirit, between self and animal, between survival and transcendence. And I think the most important thing we can do now is to remember with them. That doesn't mean pity, doesn't mean idealizing either. It just means listening. It means working with them, not around them, to understand what their history looks like through their own eyes. It means seeing the rock art not just as a dusty museum piece, but as a mirror, reflecting not just their humanity, but ours. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.